Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about that time I added too much yeast in my home brew and what to do now. The standard measure is using 1 packet of 5 grams for 5 gallons of a fermenting jar, or half a pack for 1 gallon. I typically use the EC1118 yeast. I either use the full pack, I either use half the pack, but it's easy to measure. However, if you have, let's say, a big chunk of yeast, or if you're not able to add half the pack or a full pack, rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon for 1 gallon or 5 liters, or 2 teaspoons for 5 gallons. If this doesn't sound like a lot, do not fret. Yeast are reproductive organisms, and how do they reproduce? By eating the dead cells. Therefore, when you have a live yeast and it eats the dead yeast, it will multiply. And a little yeast goes a long way. So the first aspect of adding too much yeast into your homebrew is that it'll be blurry. And wait a second, so I have 2 homebrews over here, 2 different batches, and I want you to let me know which one do you think has too much yeast. So we have option 1 here, looks a little orangey, and just remember that. And for option 2, we have this that looks a little bit darker. So which one do you think has too much yeast inside the fermenting jar? These are both jars made for my classes, and if you'd like to book a class, the link is in the description below. We show you different methods of making alcohol based on your taste. So if you prefer it dry, prefer it sweet, if you prefer beer or wine. And for those who chose jar number 1, you are correct. So there's way too much yeast added in jar number 1, and it was blurry for a while. And this blurriness is explained by more yeast floating in the same quantity of the jar. So the yeast is just everywhere. There's also yeast at the bottom. And when the yeast is at the bottom and it eats sugar, the CO2 floats to the top. So there are yeast and bubbles just floating around everywhere inside the jar. And therefore, since it's blurrier, it will take longer to clear out. And if you'd like tips on how to clear your alcohol out, you can watch the video here. And this is not the only impact of adding too much yeast. So we have the blurriness. We also have the fermentation duration. So if there's more yeast, it would make sense that the fermentation is done quicker, because the goal of fermentation is that the yeast eats all the sugar. So if there's 10 grains of yeast and only 5 sugar, it's going to be quicker than if there were 10 grains of yeast and 500 grains of sugar to eat. So we added a lot more yeast, and fermentation is not supposed to be done yet. However, I'm just going to do a little test. I'm going to use the hydrometer and see if the fermentation in the jar that has too much yeast is done. And how do we know this? Is when the hydrometer reaches 0.990 to 1.000, and this would be the final gravity of your alcohol. So let's put this to the test. In this jar, wow, the first thing I smelled when I opened this was yeast. Usually the first thing I would smell would be alcohol, because that's the goal. But this one, since it had a lot of yeast, we used 1 pack instead of half a pack. It smelled like it. And in order to find out if your alcohol is done, you need a cylinder and a hydrometer. And you can purchase these items. The link is in the description below. We have this here. To be honest, it does not smell that great. We also have a suction pump. The link is also in the description. Had to back up a bit to show you how the process works. Now for the moment of truth, we're gonna drop the hydrometer in. Oh, yeah. It's too much. I'm just gonna have to empty out a little bit more. Okay, we're ready to drop the hydrometer in the cylinder. Well, looks like it's done. Yeah, the final gravity is at 0.990 to 1.000. Specifically, it's at 0.992. And I might as well taste it, because yeast affects the flavor. So I want to see if this tastes a little bit too much like yeast, or if it's okay and it tastes like alcohol. I'm gonna pour some a bit in here. That is super full. It tastes, yeah, I definitely taste the yeast. And it tastes like juice. It's a little on the sour. It's like, it's sour and it tastes like yeast. I'm not sure how to react to this, but the yeast is definitely present. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put it in the fridge and let the yeast seep to the bottom. Therefore, I'll be able to extract the top to make sure that it's only alcohol that I'm tasting and much less yeast. Because when you ferment, it's hard to get rid of all the yeast that's present. That is usually possible once you distill. And distillation, what it is that it purifies your alcohol. So it's a step further than fermentation. It brings your alcohol from, let's say, 5 to 20%, all the way to 40%. And this is because it removes the yeast, the water, so all the unwanted extras from your alcohol. But we do not have a still since it's illegal where I'm from. And I will simply wait till the yeast goes down and bottle up the rest. So we know that yeast affects the blurriness. We know that it makes your fermentation finish quicker, and it affects the taste. Therefore, really important to add 1 teaspoon of yeast if you're making 1 gallon of alcohol. If you're making more than 1 gallon, you can use up to 2 teaspoons or 1 full packet of EC 1118, depending on the amount of alcohol that you'd like to make. But for specifically 1 gallon or 5 liters, use half the pack. Do not use more. And if you found this video valuable, share it with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.